Have you ever wondered why commercial airline flights are so safe these days? It's generally accepted that in 2024 your chances of being in a plane crash of any kind are roughly 1 in 1.2 million. Moreover, the chance of being in a fatal plane crash is even smaller, at around 1 in 11 million. It has long been repeated that human beings are therefore safer in the air than they are on the ground. In fact, you could probably wrap yourself in cotton wool and never leave your bed and still be statistically safer while traveling on board a commercial aircraft. But it wasn't always this way. As you might expect, aviation, especially in the early days, was very far from safe. Plane accidents were common. Many of them were lethal, and generally some of the greatest tragedies in the history of human transit have occurred by way of aviation disasters. Excluding 9/11, the worst air disaster that ever took place was on the Spanish island of Tenerife in 1977 when two airplanes collided on an airport runway in a catastrophic accident which claimed the lives of 583 people. Of course, that's not to say that plane crashes do not still happen. I mean, of course they do. They happen every year. But most are without any fatalities, and the total number of people killed in plane disasters has been tumbling for decades, from an average of around 1,400 deaths per year in the 1990s to around 1,000 per year in the 2010s, and that despite the number of journeys by plane dramatically increasing in that time. In short, plane crashes are now much fewer, much less deadly, and much better investigated than they were for most of aviation history. But why did that come to be? Unfortunately, the answer lies in the tragic lessons generated by plane crashes all throughout the 20th and 21st centuries. And one of the worst such examples we see was Japan Airlines Flight 123. Japan Airlines Flight 123 was supposed to be a relatively normal commercial flight. Departing Tokyo's Haneda Airport on the evening of August 12, 1985, it had a domestic heading that was bound for Osaka International Airport in Japan's then second biggest city. It departed Tokyo at 6:12 p.m. local time. The flight occurred ahead of a national holiday in Japan known as Obon, a festival of mixed Japanese and Buddhist origins with a strong emphasis on family reunion and ancestor commemoration. Many were, no doubt, traveling to spend the holiday with their kin and loved ones, and the flight to Osaka was therefore fully booked. But only 45 minutes after takeoff, the plane crashed into a ridge on the side of Mount Takamagahara in the central Japanese highlands. Of the 524 passengers and crew on board, just 4 survived. The aircraft was a Boeing 747 that had been part of the Japan Airlines fleet for 11 years. It had suffered a so-called tail strike in 1978 when the tail of the plane had clipped a runway while landing, resulting in several injuries but no fatalities amongst the staff or passengers. The damage had been repaired and the craft was returned to service soon after. The pilot of the craft, Captain Masami Takahama, was accompanied in the cockpit by flight engineer Hiroshi Fukuda and co-pilot Yatuka Sasaki, who, although he was undergoing training from Takahama to become captain of a Boeing, was also very experienced and had almost 4,000 flight hours under his belt, most of them in a 747. What the three couldn't have known, however, was that the Boeing aircraft they were flying had not been properly repaired following that tail strike accident, and this error was going to prove disastrous. The tail of the aircraft remained structurally unsound and had further been loosened by the repeated landings it had endured in the 7 years since its return to service, which had included 5 flight legs alone on the same day of the accident. Once in the air, the fault caused a rupture of the Boeing craft's aft pressure bulkhead, which quickly resulted in massive damage. 12 minutes after takeoff, the Boeing suffered sudden cabin decompression and began exhibiting signs of a loss of control, losing and gaining altitude in quick succession. Its wings began flailing in a zigzag motion known in aviation as a Dutch roll. The aircraft had lost its auxiliary power unit, or APU, its rudder, and a large portion of its vertical stabilizer. All 4 of its hydraulic lines were lost too, which meant a loss in hydraulic pressure, which severely limited the airplane's controllability. Despite this, Captain Takahama and his crew's astonishing efforts to avoid a crash meant that they managed to keep the plane airborne for a full 30 minutes after the decompression, despite likely suffering hypoxia or air deprivation, which inhibited their ability to communicate with air traffic control staff at Tokyo Airport. But the hydraulic control systems of the plane had now failed completely, and there was nothing that could prevent the inevitable. The craft began rapidly losing altitude, and its bearing brought it directly onto a collision course with the imposing Mount Takamagahara, which rises about 1,500 meters above sea level in the center of Japan. The right wing of the Boeing struck the Takamagahara Ridge at 6:56 p.m., which sent the craft hurtling from the sky. It spiraled a further 500 meters into the forested mountainside, where it exploded on impact, creating a shock strong enough to resonate on a seismometer located at a university observatory back in Tokyo. The disaster claimed the lives of a total of 520 people. It remains the worst single-aircraft plane crash by fatalities of all time, second only to the double-airplane Tenerife disaster, and fourth in terms of the absolute toll of any aviation-related disaster in history, behind the two planes which struck the Twin Towers in September 2001. Due to the isolated location of the crash site, rescue teams were unable to reach the downed plane until 14 hours after the explosion. Tragically, it was later revealed that perhaps as many as several dozen people had survived the initial impact, but did not survive the 14 hours until the arrival of emergency services. According to some sources, the site of the crash was identified by an American C-130 only 25 minutes after the accident, which relayed the coordinates of the crash site to Japanese authorities. A helicopter was purportedly dispatched by the Japan Self-Defense Forces, but the pilot reported no sign of survivors, and the rescue team did not attempt to land the helicopter in the mountain forest. But there were survivors. Miraculously, 2 women and 2 girls, seated in close proximity to each other near the center of the aircraft, somehow managed to survive the impact and the explosion before being rescued. According to the investigation report, all 4 had suffered bone fractures and traumatic shock, but their injuries were described as requiring 2 to 6 months to recover from completely. The disaster resulted in huge grief in Japan, and the site of the accident has since become a shrine to victims. Much debate raged over the causes of the accident, as well as whether more could have been done to reach the site sooner, although the accident report later concluded that almost all of the bodies showed signs of, quote, total bruise, brain damage, or bursting of internal organs, resulting in instantaneous or near instantaneous death, except for the 4 survivors. As in many such incidents, the disaster resulted in a huge downturn in the use of Japan Airlines by commercial travelers, and the company paid hundreds of millions of dollars in compensation to the families of the survivors. The safety of the Boeing 747 was also called into question, which resulted in a string of new safety protocols for all such craft, including mandatory visual inspections of the aft side of the pressure bulkhead every 2,000 flight cycles, and X-ray or ultrasonic inspections of the rear side of the bulkhead every 4,000 flight cycles once a plane has completed 20,000 flights. But in spite of the unmitigated tragedy of the event, the response to it from the aviation industry and Japan Airlines was competent and responsible, and provides a case in point of how flight safety has come forward in leaps and bounds in the time since. As pointed out by author Matthew Said in his 2015 book Black Box Thinking, the aviation industry has distinguished itself for the thoroughness of its investigation into accidents and its willingness to make necessary adaptations and changes in order to prevent a recurrence of any of the conditions which led to the accident in the first place. And as if by example, the investigation into the Flight 123 disaster, jointly carried out by Japan's government's Aircraft Accident Investigation Commission and the US National Transportation Safety Board, was nothing if not exhaustive. The full report, translated into English, has been published and made available online as open source information, perhaps as a benefit to all aviation industries elsewhere in the world. Of the 337 pages of the report, 27 pages describe the facts of the disaster, the meteorological conditions, the casualties and flight information, and more than 100 were devoted to the infinitesimal studies of the hardware and systems failures which caused the craft to fall out of the sky. Japan Airlines, the country's national carrier, eventually recovered from the downturn in passenger preference and embarked upon a strict safety training structure for its staff in order to eliminate any potential repeat of the disaster. Staff were rigorously schooled in evacuation procedures and emergency responses, with the company's safety rules later described by CNN as being effectively written in blood. Each crew member was obliged to carry with them a copy of the airline's safety charter, and the airline also pursued disciplined adherence to international plane maintenance protocols and systems oversight. In 2006, a corporate safety and security division was formed, reporting directly to Japan Airlines president. One of its duties is to provide assistance at a memorial ceremony in Uno Village on Mount Takamagahara, carried out annually for the families of the deceased Flight 123 passengers and crew. Japan Airlines has not suffered fatalities on board any of its aircraft in the almost 4 decades since the accident, and its devotion to extreme adherence to safety and security protocols has become a defining feature of its corporate culture in the time since. In 2024, Japan Airlines was ranked in the top 25 safest airlines in the world by airline safety aggregator AirlineRatings.com. And the strict adherence to upholding safety standards remains affected through the prism of the horrific calamity of Flight 123. In 2006, the airline opened a museum-like facility at their corporate headquarters near Haneda Airport, which displays wreckage from Flight 123 and is aimed at promoting safety awareness among its employees. And those stringent safety awareness mechanisms have provided tangible results. Not only the steep drop in the number of fatalities due to plane crashes by year, despite the increase in air traffic, but also even in more individual circumstances. In January 2024, another Japan Airlines flight suffered an almost calamity when it collided with a smaller plane operated by the Japanese Coast Guard at Haneda Airport in Tokyo. With 367 passengers on board, Japan Airlines Flight had just landed at the airport from the city of Sapporo when it collided with the smaller plane, resulting in an inferno which utterly engulfed both aircraft. And although 5 of the 6 people on the Coast Guard plane died, the staff of the Japan Airlines flight, expertly drilled in safety and evacuation procedures, managed to shepherd every last passenger and crew member off the plane before it caught fire. There was not a single casualty on board.